Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to look at the teaching method I use for teaching all scales simultaneously. In this case, we're talking about the major scales, and we're going to use the cycle of fourths to do that. So if you're not familiar with what the cycle of fourths is, just as a quick explanation, the cycle of fourths and the cycle of fifths are complementary cycles. You'll see there's a circle in front of us here. If we were to move around to the left-hand side, we'd be traveling through what we call the cycle of fourths. If we were to go clockwise, we'd be traveling through what we call the cycle of fifths. They're mirror versions of each other effectively. We're going to start with the cycle of fourths, but because this is the one that I use when I'm teaching these scales. So if you're not sure what the cycle of fourths is, just as a quick explanation, if you travel from the C to the F counterclockwise around the cycle, the distance between the C and the F is a perfect fourth. Another way of thinking about that is 5 semitones. The same thing, but if I travel from F to B flat, that's also a perfect fourth. B flat to E flat, also a perfect fourth. You continue traveling around by perfect fourth and you will eventually make your way back to C. So the couple of interesting points here is that we've moved by the same interval each time and that we have traveled through all 12 tones that exist in our chromatic scale, getting us back to the starting note. So the first thing I want students to understand is the cycle of fourths, how it looks on the keyboard and what it sounds like. So when I'm getting students to become familiar with this for the first time, the one thing I don't do is show them a stave. I'm not interested in them reading these notes. I'm not interested in them understanding key signature or anything like that. All we're looking at is just what that pattern of cycle of fourths looks like and what it sounds like. And as I say, I'm dealing with this on the keyboard. Other instruments may or may not get any value out of this, but certainly it works really well for my keyboard students. So to see how this looks on the stave, let's take a look at that. Okay, so here we are on the stave, and effectively what we have here is the cycle of fourths displayed across the stave here. And as we cycle through each of these notes, we're going to see the corresponding note light up on the keyboard down here. So we're going to begin with this C. And you notice the C that I've started on is the C above middle C. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that all of the notes within the cycle of fourths, you'll see, all fit within the treble stave without any need for ledger lines. There's also a kind of up-down pattern that you see here, which is broken once at this point here, where you see we travel up 2 steps before coming back down and resuming that up and down cycle. The reason for that is to get us back to the same note that we started with. So you'll see here that I've started on the C above middle C, and I've ended on exactly the same C. I want that to happen. I want to have the same start and end point, because later on we're going to get the student to start at various points within the cycle. And it's important that wherever they start, they end up coming back to the same place. Hence why we've had this little break in the cycle here just to make that work. So just to see how this sounds and how it works when we step through. In particular, I want you to take a look at the pattern that's formed as a result of playing through this cycle. So from the C, we travel up to the F. Now we could continue traveling up to the B flat, but what we actually do is drop back to the B flat. So we go from C to F, and then we drop to the B flat, which is a tone below the note we started on, the B flat there. And then we move to the E flat, which is a tone below the F, the note 2 notes back. So you'll see that we've got this kind of cyclic pattern that goes on. Let's go back to the C and play through it. So C, upper fourth to F, upper fourth to B flat, to E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat. At this point we come back to the white keys, so onto B, and this is also the point where I break the pattern. So once we come back to the white keys, we do 2 upward movements and we move up to the E. Then we're down to the A, up to D, down to G, and back to C. So that at this stage, that's all I really want the student to be able to do, is to play through that cycle of fourths and importantly name the notes as we go. You'll also notice that I've only used flats in this example. There's no sharps anywhere, and that's primarily to keep things simple. Later on we do have to deal with things like, for example, the key of D flat, which is also known as C sharp, and the key of G flat, which is also known as F sharp, and the key of B, which is also known as C flat, and so forth. We have to deal with those enharmonics later, but for the moment, we're not concerned with it. I'm not concerned with key signature or anything like that. All I want them to do is to be able to see the cycle, be able to state the notes of the cycle as they go, and to be able to play through them. A good exercise to do once the student is familiar with this is to start the cycle in a different place. So for example, we might say to them, okay, I want you to start on this E flat this time, but they do the same thing. We move through the cycle of fourths and they would eventually get back to the E flat. Another thing that's good to do is to get them to read the cycle to you without being in front of the piano. You might start off by doing this in C, just to get back to the pattern they're familiar with. But again, at that point, you want to also start introducing this at different points. So let's say, for example, start at G flat. Get them to play through that cycle in their head so they see the pattern on the keyboard. This is really important. It's the major focus of this, is to see the pattern on the keyboard and be able to hear the relationships between the notes as you go. Okay, so at the point where they're comfortable with the cycle of fourths, the next step is to start building up the scales. And we build them up in such a way that we learn all of them simultaneously. To describe that, we'll go back to the diagram. Okay, so back on our diagram of our cycle of fourths. As we've said, they're now familiar with being able to play this cycle and familiar with being able to start at any point and traverse that cycle. So the next thing we do when we talk about scales is we introduce the first interval. So the first interval of the major scale, for example, is our tone. So what the student's now going to do is they're going to play a pattern which we refer to sometimes as a digital pattern. If we think about the first two steps of the C major scale, we've got a C and then a tone up, we've got the D. Another way of thinking about that is the first step of the scale and the second step of the scale. So the pattern I want them to play is 1, 2, 1. So that's why we refer to it as a digital pattern, because we use digits in place of notes. I don't want them to be thinking of all of these scales as different. Part of the exercise, or part of the reason for doing it this way, is that all the major scales are the same. They're all the same pattern: tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Doesn't matter where you begin, the same pattern applies. So what the student does is they build up these digital patterns at each step around the cycle of fourths. So for example, at C, the pattern would be C, D, C. At F, the pattern would be F, G, F. At B flat, the pattern would be B flat, C, B flat, and so on and so on. We're going to switch back to the stave in a minute to see this, but it's important, especially for teachers and for students who are listening, and teachers who may want to use this in their own teaching. The important thing is, don't show the stave. Okay, we don't want students to be reading these things as just read exercises. We want them to be exercising that grey matter and thinking about how this structure of the first step of the scale, the tone, how it looks, how it sounds, and to be using what they already know, the cycle of fourths, to build that up. So as I say, very important not to use the stave. But to demonstrate this, we'll switch back to the stave just so we can see what's going on. Okay, so here we are back at the stave, and this is what the 1-2-1 digital pattern looks like if we were to travel all the way through the cycle of fourths. So we're starting at C and we're ending at C. Once again, later on, we want students to be beginning in different places, but at the moment, starting in C is fine. It's just important that the student doesn't start to get in their head that the cycle of fourths is something that begins and ends in C. It's cyclic, it begins anywhere, and all the same rules apply. So for the sake of the exercise, we're going to start in C here. And you'll notice that if we play the first two steps, or the first digital pattern step of this, so the 1-2-1 pattern, we'll have a C, up to a D, and back to a C. The important thing they see is the tone interval that exists there. So what does the tone interval look like on the piano? Well, in this case, because there's a black note immediately above the white note, it's going to be a white note to a white note, back to a white note again. And again, it's important they say the names of the notes as they're playing. This is C, D, C. That's really important that they say those names of those notes. At that point, we then move to our next step on the cycle, which is the F. And in this case, the tone pattern looks the same because, again, we have a black note immediately above the F. So the tone pattern is going to look like that white, white, white kind of pattern that we had before. So F to G, back to F again. When we get to the next step, at B flat, for example, so here's our B flat. The note that's a tone higher, well, if we're on a black note and we have two white notes above it, then we know that this tone is going to be this note here, which is the C. So we'll have a B flat to a C, back to a B flat. Now, the diagram in their head, or the visual model in their head, looks exactly the same at E flat. So E flat, again, because it's the top note of a group of black notes, we know that the tone higher is going to be the two white notes higher than that. So it'll be E flat to F, back to E flat. And again, that's a visual picture I want them to be able to see. It looks the same as B flat. B flat and E flat have the same kind of picture. We then move to the next step, A flat. At this point, because we're not at the top black key of a group of black notes, we know the tone higher is going to be the next black key. So A flat to B flat to A flat. We then move to D flat, and again the pattern looks the same. D flat to E flat to D flat. When we move to G flat, again it's the same pattern. G flat, A flat, G flat. Now at this point we're moving out of the black keys and back to the white keys. And this is kind of like the pattern we had before from B flat. So B flat to C and E flat to F. That was one tone pattern that we had. This one is going the other way. It was starting on the white note. We don't have a black note immediately above. So we have to travel the two semitones or the tone to get to this next black note. So the B to C sharp to B. And again, it looks exactly the same as the E because E has the same conditions, no black note above it. So we have to travel the tone, which takes us to F sharp, back to E. When we get back to A, we're now getting back to the first pattern we saw, which was C to D to C. Again, it's the same arrangement. We're on a white key with a black key immediately above it, so we know that the tone higher is going to be another white key. So A to B to A, it's the same pattern at D, same pattern at G, and finally back to C. So when they're going through this exercise, as I've said, there's a couple of things I want to reinforce for them. The first thing is to say it's really important they name the notes. That's really, really important. Name the notes and name the notes correctly. So for example, if we were at the step of E here, for example, this note here is not G flat. Okay, so the rules for naming notes in the major scale, always use the next available letter name, never skip one, never repeat one. So the first step of E major is obviously E, but the next step has to be some kind of F. Okay, it's the next available letter. So E, F sharp, E. This is important when we get into longer digital patterns where there are more options of what you may name a note. It's really important that we use the correct note because that also is going to speak to the key signature that we're going to look at a little bit later on. Okay, so again, what they're doing here, we want them to play through this 1-2-1 pattern. I want them to be able to start in different places on the cycle. I also want to be able to start quizzing them away from the keyboard. So for example, give me the digital pattern 1-2-1 at the step of D flat. And what I want them to do is refer to that mental model in their head. What does it look like? D flat. It's not the top black key of a black key group, so I know the next tone is going to be a black key higher. And all the time we're reinforcing what the tones look like. A point I may have made before, but just to reinforce, one of the things this 1-2-1 exercise does is it shows you every single tone interval on the piano, all of them. We don't miss one at any point. So every single tone interval is looked at. Okay, the next step from this would be to add the next step of the pattern. So for example, in the major scale, we've already traveled the tone for the 1-2-1. To do the digital pattern 1-2-3-1, we'd need to travel an additional tone. So there's the tone between the first and second step, and there's the tone between the second and third step. So that's the next thing we do. And in the case of C major, we'd have C, D, E, back to C again. In the case of F major, F, G, A, back to F again, and so forth. I'm going to step a couple ahead and go to the 1-2-3-4-5 pattern just to show a longer example of how this might work and how we look at the semitone movements and so forth. So here's the 1-2-3-4-5-1 pattern. A couple of things to note here. You'll notice that I'm always coming back to the first step. So if we had, we just looked at the 1-2-1, the next digital pattern after that will be 1-2-3-1. The next digital pattern would be 1-2-3-4-1, and so on and so on. We're coming back to the 1. The reason for that is to give the appropriate jump off to the next point around the cycle. So we know the distance, for example, cycle of fourths wise from C is moving to the F. So by coming back to the C here at the end of this pattern, so this C here, it just means we give a reference point for where the next point is. Something you might do as a more advanced exercise later is to remove that last note. Have them play 1-2-3-4-5 and then 1-2-3-4-5 in the next point around the cycle. No reason why you can't do that, but in the first instance, it's probably nice to come back to the 1 and just allow that reference point. One other thing I should note as well is you'll notice that if I was to step back to the previous example, for example, in 1-2-1, you notice I've written this using a quarter note, half note, quarter note, half note. It's important to note the only reason that I've done that is just so that we can display it on the stave for reference purposes here. The actual rhythm of what's going on is not important. I don't care if students have to pause and think about things at certain steps. As I say, it's not a technical exercise. It's designed to be or not a physically technical exercise. It's a mentally technical exercise. So I'm trying to get them to build this mental model in their head. So it doesn't matter about rhythm or time. That's not important. So the same thing here. I've written this in 6/4 just to make it nice and easy to see on the stave. But rhythm is not important in this exercise. So again, the same thing would be happening here. We'd be looking at these patterns that exist. So for example, for the first 5, starting at C, upper tone, upper semitone, upper tone, and back to the original note. And then we do the same thing at F. Up the semitone, gets us the B flat, up the tone, and back to F. Now, if we go back to the B flat there, for example, so we've had this interval of F to G is the tone, G to A is the tone, A to B flat is the semitone, and then B flat to C is the tone. Now, as I said before about 1, 2, 1, we saw all of the possible tone intervals that existed in that 1, 2, 1 exercise. So here, what I'm hoping is that the student is carrying over the info they had from previous examples. So in the 1, 2, 1, they saw that B flat to C as being the tone interval. So it should be reasonably straightforward when they get to this point of saying it's a tone higher. Well, I know that that looks like this on the piano. So again, this is all about building this mental model. One of the things you always want to do at any stage you're doing these exercises is to quiz students mentally about what they're doing. Take them away from the piano, get them to give you the first 5 steps of the G flat major scale, for example. I think you'll be surprised of how well this works. I must admit, I thought it was going to be just intuitively thought it was a good way of going about things, but I have to say the results have sort of far exceeded my expectations. I've got students who are picking these up very, very quickly, building their mental models really, really well and being able to answer questions about things away from the keyboard. Okay, so eventually we get to a situation where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and instead of coming back to the 1, we just carry on up to 8, which of course is also a 1, but just the 1 higher. And of course at that point they've completed all of the scales. So what do they have at that point? Well, they have a good mental model of what tones and semitones look like on the piano. They have models that show the similarity between certain scales. You know, for example, the C major scale and the G major scale look pretty similar. But the reason they look pretty similar is because the mental models they have of tone and semitone relationships that they built up through this process. So I'm not that interested in understanding the relationship between C major and G major. One thing I think that's worth avoiding is we don't want to do things like say, well, G major is just like C major, except it has an F sharp, because that assumes a relationship between C major and G major in terms that don't really musically make sense. The only time that I'd really want to draw a relationship between C major and G major is if I was musically trying to have a relationship between those. For example, transposing from one key to another. That would be useful to understand. But to artificially create relationships between keys, I think is counterproductive. Anyway, I hope that's been useful. This is, as I say, this is the methodology that I use for teaching major scales now. It seems to work really well. I'd be really interested to hear from teachers in particular if they do adopt this process, how they get on with it. And by all means, if you have any questions or you want to discuss this with me, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. And we may even be able to take that offline and have a bigger discussion if we need to. So I hope that's been useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Please like and share the video. And as I say, leave any questions or comments you have below, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks for listening and see you soon.